right, our third speaker is Youssef Chouhoud, he's an assistant professor of political science at Christopher Newport University, and he's speaking on the topic of inheritance laws and the limits of and prospects for gender equality in the MENA region.
All right, excellent. So this mic is working. I just want to make sure that I have some leeway. I'm Arab and I was raised in Brooklyn, so I'm very kinetic when I speak. It doesn't take too long when you're talking to an average layperson about the Middle East. It's kind of like Godwin's law, but a variation of it. At a certain point, some discussion of authoritarianism or women's rights approaches, probability of 1, right? So instead of, kind of paying attention to what every Tom, Dick, and Ahmed says about, democracy in the Middle East, let's see what, some scholars have said. So in terms of gender inequality and whether it impedes democracy, one of the kind of foremost studies, or first study, I should say, was done by Stephen Fish, where he's actually one of the first people to kind of empirically test this kind of Islam authoritarianism connection. He found the connection, and he says that gender inequality, right? That's the causal pathway. Engelhardt and Norris, and he used kind of these objective kind of socioeconomic indicators. Engelhardt and Norris, more or less come to the same conclusion, but they're looking at kind of inegalitarian attitudes. They're looking at the attitudes of the average person in these countries, and how that leads to kind of a throttling of democracy, if you will. Now these studies kind of had some pushback, more or less as soon as they came out. Donald and Russet, for example, kind of refine these objective indicators, more robustly kind of model what it is that they're trying to capture, and they kind of push back against Fish's findings. And Fish actually ultimately kind of recants in terms of really leaning into gender inequality being the causal issue. And our own Dr. Amani Jamel, with her colleague, also kind of reassessed the survey data, kind of linking gender inequality and democracy, and they similarly, don't find that there's a link there to actual real impediments to democracy. What about the other way around? Can democracy actually augment gender equality? Here too, there's been some kind of mixed empirical findings. But perhaps more interesting are the mixed kind of theoretical findings. On the one hand, intuitively, we imagine gender equality to be a core liberal democratic norm. One which, as with many liberal democratic norms, as the rough and tumble of democratic politics ensues, gets more instantiated in society. However, in the MENA context, as Dr. Jamel, as my own kind of mentor, Dr. Lloyd Brand, and many others have noted, authoritarians often instrumentalize women's rights. So authoritarian support for egalitarian policies, are seen as kind of in the face of more an egalitarian public opinion. So all this is not necessarily to say that we shouldn't kind of care about the link between gender equality and democracy. We should care about it kind of in its own right. However, kind of leaning in on this latter point here about the MENA context. My colleague and I, we really want to kind of interject and kind of get at some kind of causal claims with regards to gender equality in the MENA region. And so we looked at Tunisia as a site for research. As many scholars kind of noted, Tunisia has this kind of legacy of really instantiating women's rights more so than any other country in the region. This begins under Habib Bourguiba. This continues under Zainuddin bin Ali. And in fact, on the eve of the Arab uprisings in 2010, when Freedom House kind of published a comprehensive analysis of women's rights across the region, Tunisia was far and away the country that kind of led the pack in that regard. But that's certainly not to say that after the uprising, there wasn't further advancement Indeed, we can see the advancement of women's rights in a number of arenas during this period of democratic, this kind of nascent democracy, right, in Tunisia. Yet during the time of Bourguiba, during the time of Ben Ali, right, during this authoritarian era, as well as during this kind of era of the democratic opening in Tunisia, there was one issue, right? One issue in which, they really couldn't get much traction on. And that was the issue of inheritance law reform. In fact, for all of his clout, for all of his, kind of desire to bring about a systemic change to Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba just simply didn't really want to kind of engage in moving forward with changing inheritance law. This is a technical term, right? And so it was left to his self-styled ideological heir, Beji Khaled al-Sibsi, to kind of take up this issue. And so in 2017, he initially kind of nodded to the fact that he wanted to equalize inheritance. And in 2018, he went ahead and actually push forward a bill that would, kind of, in effect, do that. There was some support, obviously. There was certainly pockets of support for this, but there was also some concerted pushback from at the mass level as well as the elite level. From religious elites, yes, but also from political elites. Not surprisingly, much of the pushback from the political elite end came from Ennahda. And this is, this is notable because Ennahda actually was, very supportive of many of the reforms that took place, since the Arab uprising. But, on a couple of issues, inheritance law being one of them, they were really kind of quite firm in their opposition. So why is that? Put differently, what makes inheritance law distinctive? If you look in the Quran, it really doesn't take you too long to come to the conclusion that the distinction is in the excruciating detail, right? With which the kind of Quran kind of goes through the issue of inheritance law. For example, Allah commands you regarding your children, the share of the male will be twice that of the female. If you only have 2 or more females, their share is 2/3 of the estate, so on and so forth. This is one area. Go on to the next area. Again, if you have children, then your wives will receive 1/8 of the estate after the fulfillment of the requested right. So this is a really great detail, and the thing is, it's really rare to have this kind of level of detail in the Quran. Put differently, there really isn't any wiggle room when it comes to the issue of inheritance, right? So, many individuals kind of spoke today about the prospects for compromise, the prospects for evolution. On this issue, it's really hard to kind of come to a space where there is compromise. It really is something of an either or. It really is something close to a zero-sum rendering. You either, pay heed to the strictures, or you don't. And so we argue that this comparatively unambiguous nature of inheritance law, that again leaves little room for compromise, leads to a couple of empirical expectations. First, that egalitarian attitudes, that is, attitudes in support of gender equality, will actually be depressed when inheritance is invoked. But we also expect that this negative effect will be kind of most observable among those who kind of support public religiosity, put kind of crudely, that support Sharia in the public square. So how did we go ahead and test this? We ran a nationally representative face-to-face poll of 900 Tunisians. We actually used the same firm as the Arab Barometer, and we did this during a time when there were no kind of noteworthy shocks. It was actually one of these rare periods during the post-uprising context in Tunisia when it was just regular schmegular politics, right? It wasn't anything kind of existential, kind of top of mind. And so we asked direct questions as well as survey experiments. So let me show you the results from the direct questions first. So we asked whether a married woman women can work outside the home, whether a university education for men is more important than women. On both of these questions, we find overwhelming egalitarian support. And these questions are also asked on a number of other surveys, among them the Arab Barometer as well, with very similar kind of outcomes. Where we do find a bit more kind of parity is on this question of, do men make better political leaders than women? I'll get to that in a second. But for our purposes, the most important thing is when it comes to issues of equal inheritance, there is overwhelming disagreement, overwhelming inegalitarianism on that specific issue. So let me step back for a moment and just talk about this political leadership thing. It does seem like there's something not just in Tunisia but across the globe when it comes to issues of women taking political leadership roles. We see this in a number of even established democracies. With regard to the equal inheritance bit, we see that it's similar for both men and women, right? It isn't kind of a function of gender whether you go for it or not. So that's a descriptive analysis. Let's turn to the experiment. So we asked a certain portion of our respondents whether they support the following statement: the state should provide equal political, economic, and social rights for men and women on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, so a 5-point scale. We had a bureaucratic treatment, so to see is it just simply a matter of kind of deference to tradition? So we asked, according to Tunisian civil code, men receive double the inheritance of women, and then we gave them kind of the same text up here thereafter, asking them, do they support equal treatment of women and men? And then lastly, we had the Quranic treatment. According to Surah An-Nisa, men receive double the inheritance of women. Again, and then asking them, do you support the state kind of equalizing the treatment of men and women? So what did we find? Well, we found that those who got the control were significantly higher, significantly more egalitarian than those who were primed to consider the issue of inheritance law. And, somewhat surprisingly, we found that there was no difference between the bureaucratic and the Quranic treatment, meaning that this is really kind of baked into this issue, right? The kind of nod to Sharia is really kind of baked into this issue. It's not simply a matter of kind of tradition. So whereas the control you see kind of very comfortably in the egalitarian range, now you're plausibly in the inegalitarian range when you start to invoke inheritance law. So we said let's kind of probe this linkage to support for Sharia a bit more. Because I'm kind of a little short on time, I'll just kind of note that we had this index, an index that had some pretty decent kind of variation that allowed us to test whether religiosity, support for public religiosity really was doing any work to kind of move the needle on this. And what we find is that similarly, as you become more in support of public religiosity, whether you got the bureaucratic treatment or you got the Quranic treatment, you become significantly less egalitarian in your view of equal rights between women and men. And here's the kicker, right? So thus far I've shown you kind of the limits of gender equality. But remember, in the descriptive data, we showed that there were these very egalitarian attitudes. Here too, we can see that there's a very egalitarian consistency, right, across support for Sharia amongst the control. So those who are at the highest level of Sharia support are just as likely statistically as those at the lowest level of Sharia support, right, to kind of express egalitarian attitudes, right? It's only when you start invoking this issue of inheritance law that gets pulled down. So to conclude, some findings and implications. We argue that inheritance law falls outside this kind of traditional matrix of gender equality. And this has some empirical and kind of theoretical implications. Empirically, for those who are kind of trying to code levels of gender equality, I think it behooves them to not simply uncritically include a measure of support for inheritance law in that coding. It could lead you to kind of disregard an otherwise much higher level of gender equality that exists in that context. Theoretically too, perhaps we can start thinking about how policies like this form the content of concepts like Islamic or Muslim democracy. And then lastly, we saw that the invocation of inheritance reform really hampers otherwise more egalitarian attitudes towards women's rights. And so this has very clear kind of implications, right? So there is this kind of space of an overlapping consensus. But once you kind of populate that space with this content of inheritance law, that space becomes much more constrained. So that's really important for foreign policy actors, whether they be kind of states or whether they be kind of NGOs. Human Rights Watch, for example, was very critical of Enacta for doing what they thought was kind of a 180, supporting a lot of women's rights reform, but then standing firm against inheritance law. On balance, our research shows that that might be kind of negative in the long-term net, but also this is really important for domestic policymakers to kind of keep this in mind whenever politics in Tunisia goes back to being regular schmegular, whenever that is there is the next democratic opening in Tunisia, inshallah. Thank you for your time.